Hey everyone out there, welcome back Patriots. I am your host, Ron Kern, and I appreciate you guys tuning in. This is a doozy for you to tune in. Researching, studying, writing about the revolution, as you know, is my passion. And I want to thank all of you for allowing me to share my passion with you. And this is just my 27th episode, which is a lot to me, but as we'll find out, not so much with our guest. But today's a very special one. What makes it most special is that we have the privilege of having Michael Troy with us. He's an expert on the American Revolution, and truth be told, I've never told him this, but he's really the inspiration behind me creating this podcast. I've always been kind of an entrepreneur and all of that, but after listening to him for several years, I was like, I want to do that. So he inspired me to create this. He is the creator and host of the American Revolution podcast, which personally I consider one of the most thorough and detailed podcasts pertaining to the American Revolution, bar none, that's available. And when I first really started getting wild about the American Revolution, I wanted to learn more. And so I'm searching every podcast, every video, every YouTube. And the search was not real good. The results I found were lackluster at best. Or they summarized everything about before the war, after the war, the first 5 presidents in about 7 episodes, which I'm like, huh? How is that even possible? So, but then I found your podcast and I started listening and I'm like, where does he get this information? Like, how did he find this and that? And of course, my previous life, I owned an investigation firm. So I'm like, well, I can maybe find it. But the stuff you come up with is amazing, which I'll ask you about here shortly. Your attention to detail in every episode, and it's not just here and there, it's every single episode, to me is extraordinary. They're always insightful. I almost send me on several rabbit holes with every one of your podcasts. I know firsthand the sheer amount of time it takes to research, record, the dreaded editing, publishing for just one episode, and I can't fathom how much time it takes you, because I know how long it takes me, but it is a question I'll get to. Now, the other exciting thing is that not only is it our first ever guest interview, which I can't imagine anybody better than you being here, but it's also our inaugural video episode. So if you're listening right now, like you normally do, don't worry, you can catch the video version by following the link, which will be in the show notes. We got some pretty cool stuff planned for Patriot Power Podcast YouTube channel and all of that fun stuff. But let's get back to Michael Troy, who launched the American Revolution podcast in July of 2017. That's over 5 years of historical excellence, with an impressive 277 episodes and almost 6 million downloads. That's probably a fraction of how many people have listened to you. It's evident that you're not making history interesting. You're really captivating the audience. And I feel that most people need and should hear and learn about the American Revolution, what created our country, and you do so well. Your most recent episode was 4 or 5 days ago, and you have finally reached, or not finally, but you've talked about the Battle of Cowpens. So knowing where that falls along chronologically, thankfully for me and many others, we have a lot more episodes from you to come. So I've done a little bit of recon. I read some interviews that you've been in, watched a couple of videos, and I want to make this a little different, hopefully for you, and a little more unique. So I will be quiet now. And Michael Troy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now you live in New Jersey?
Yes.
Okay. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your previous life before you started the daunting process of creating the American Revolution podcast?
Well, sure. I've always been interested in the revolution my whole life. I think one of the first books I read when I was 5 years old was a kid's biography of George Washington. And I think I've been hooked ever since. It's just a very fascinating topic for me. And I've grown up in the greater Philadelphia area. I lived in Delaware for a time, and I live in South Jersey, right across from Philadelphia now, which, of course, is a cradle for much of what happened during the American Revolution. A lot of great things happened in the area. So it's just always been a part of my life and very interesting. So um, a few years ago, I decided I really wanted to do a deep dive. I mean, I've always read about the revolution, but you read a book here, a book there, you don't really necessarily get the whole story and context. So I really wanted to do a deep dive into the subject. And I had originally anticipated doing a blog just to kind of keep track of where I was going with through all of it. But at the time, in I guess 2016, when I was planning all this, blogs were on their way out and podcasts were in. And I thought, all right, let's see if my voice is any decent enough to do a recording that people will listen to. We'll try it that way and see what happens.
It must be because I know a lot of people listen to you. Is it so? Did you have anybody that maybe mentored you, or did you jump into the fire and hope it all worked out, or was there somebody that maybe inspired you to start this endeavor, or was it just kind of on your own?
I didn't really have a mentor. I didn't know anyone personally who did podcasts. I was inspired by Mike Duncan, who I'm sure a lot of your listeners know. He's a great podcaster in the history field.
Mm-hmm.
One of probably the first podcast I ever listened to was the History of Rome. And it was just because I was on a long road trip and I said, looked through the history podcast and said, I don't know a whole lot about History of Rome. That sounds interesting. I'll try that. And I was hooked immediately. I thought he did an amazing job with covering lots of details about a topic that I kind of knew but didn't know in detail. So I was interested in learning a lot more about it. And the fact that he could do it and be funny and informative at the same time, and that so many people were interested in listening to that, kind of inspired me to say, well, yeah, maybe I could do something like that as well. Many of your listeners may know that Mike went on to do a second podcast called Revolutions, which covers a whole bunch of different revolutions throughout the world. The American Revolution was his second season, and he whipped through the American Revolution in less than 20 episodes. So I had been really looking forward to that one, and I was kind of disappointed. I mean, it was great for what it was, but it was, like you said, a lot of people do short summaries of the American Revolution. They don't get into as much detail as I would have liked. And so I think it was after that I decided, all right, I got to do something on this because nobody else is.
Yeah, somebody's got to do it, right? Which brings me to this. Yeah, I've listened to that, and I was excited to listen to it too. And I went, one through, there's only 20. Oh no! I mean, it was good, like you said, but I guess I've never been called a nerd, but I guess I am kind of I have history nerd decal. I guess I am. So yeah, it's proof I'm a history nerd. Well, the Zoom doesn't show, but I have a decal. Apparently, I'm a nerd. I mean, obviously, his focus is a little more wider, but I think yours and mine are pretty similar. And although being the revolution, but you had 3 other blogs, or were any of those other podcasts like Unlearned History? You did some other things previous to this, right?
I had a blog called Unlearned History, which is basically history you didn't learn in school. That was the idea behind it. It was just random, interesting articles about different things.
Yeah.
And I just did that for my own amusement. Never really went anywhere. It was while I was doing that blog that I decided I really want to focus on the American Revolution and do that in detail. And because I had no experience in podcasting or recording or anything, I thought, well, every podcaster will tell you their first season just sucks because they're learning the business during that time and the technical details. So I thought, all right, what I'll do is I'll go back and I'll just record all of my Unlearned History blog articles as podcasts, just to figure out which microphones work best, how my voice sounds, learn how to do editing, all those things. So I kind of got my first horrible season out of the way by recording that. And I did post it online, but I never actually submitted it to an RSS feed. So kudos for you for finding it, because I've never made an effort to let anyone find it anywhere.
Yeah, I figure anything that you put out is worth listening to. So obviously everybody has their own process or maybe habits of creating an episode. Can you walk us through the process that you go through in creating an episode? Obviously, I throw in bonus episodes here and there, so it kind of gives me a break from the chronological. Yours is definitely super detailed and thorough as far as chronological. What is your process for creating an episode, and how long does it take you from start to publishing it for one episode, or have you ever timed it?
Well, it's hard to say because I'm usually working on a bunch of episodes at once. When I actually started planning this podcast in early 2016, and as you said, I didn't release episode 1 until July of 2017. I spent a lot of the time was recording my Unlearned Histories and improving my abilities there, but I was also doing a lot of research and writing during that time. And I had nearly 100 episodes written by the time I released episode 1. And that was an important thing for me, because what I really like to do is write the episode and then write a few more after it. And then sometimes when you've written things that happen afterwards, you think, oh, I really should have covered X, Y, or Z in that earlier episode. You can write that in before you're actually recording it. So I'd write an episode and then hopefully come back to it months later and look at it a second time and say, all right, well, this is how I want to change it. So I would do that. I'd write the episode, then I have to record the episode, edit it, write up the blog, which I have a sister blog that follows each episode, which is basically as a transcript of the podcast. And I add pictures and maps and a bibliography of all the sites and books that I use to create the episode. The whole process, I would guess, probably takes me about 30 hours per episode for what's a half an hour episode.
And I think, I don't think most people understand the amount of time, work, and unless it becomes something insanely popular, we're probably not going to retire from our podcast. You might be, but so you and I want to touch base on the sister blog. I find that to be completely, maybe a lot of people listen to it and don't visit your sister blog. I highly encourage you guys to do that, because everything that is in his episodes, he has links to books and photographs, and it really helps complement the show's, what you listen to, the episode part. And is there any, so I'm assuming because you list off the books that you use and you have some links, is there anything that you go for specifically regarding primary sources? Because it still boggles my mind on how detailed, you rattle off quotes and facts that aren't in most books, and for that matter, I presume you have to scour some primary sources to even get some of them. Is there anything that you're using that you go to first, or is there something that's a super valuable tool while doing your research?
I do use a lot of books. I'd love to do more primary research, but you don't have the time. I do dig into it on some things when I find an interesting issue, or there's a authors disagreeing on a point or something like that, then I might dig in a little deeper. But I try to mostly stick to books and use credible books by established authors who are good at and really know what they're doing about a topic. So yeah, I mean, I have a huge library, as you can see behind
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
Those are all American Revolution books on that shelf, on that
Yeah.
whole shelf there. Um, I used my library a lot, and my library, like most libraries, has an interlibrary loan program. So if there's a really obscure book you want and your library system doesn't have it, you can order it and they will get it from another library across the country and deliver it to you to use to read. So that sort of thing is very helpful. Um, archive.org obviously has
Yeah.
a huge number of both documents and books
Mhm.
available to read, which I find very useful. Um, founders.archive.gov, which is a site run by the National Archives, is a great place for primary research. It basically has the correspondence of all the founding fathers, and you can do word searches and topic searches and date searches for all sorts of things. So, like when I was covering a few weeks ago the mutiny of the Pennsylvania and New Jersey lines, all of that happened within about a 4-week period. So I just went through every single letter that every officer and politician wrote to everybody else within that 4 to 6 week period. And it gave me a whole lot of information on what was going on.
Well, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but once if you haven't listened to his website, or listen to his podcast, I'll have a link to everything. Just click and go to it. You will understand what I'm talking about. So you don't just Google, and or use AI. Write me a podcast, right? A lot of people are doing that now.
No, I actually tried that once and it was horrible
Yeah, yeah.
just to
I
see what
mean,
it could do.
yeah, that's a scary topic. So
Yeah.
I think what's really a great thing that you did um, is that you didn't start with, all right, I'm going to do a podcast on the American Revolution, and it started with Lexington and Concord. A lot of people think that, but you spent almost 20 episodes going back and giving a history lesson and a background of the French and Indian War, and also provided other historical snapshots that really lay the framework down prior to the Revolution. The French and Indian War, sometimes called the 7 Years' War, which is odd because it didn't go 7 years, but I'll never, maybe you know the answer to that. But is there a moment or an event or a person during the French and Indian War that stands out to you, or something interesting about that particular war that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I sometimes joked, especially in my first year, I went an entire year without even talking about the American Revolution because it was, I believe it was episode 52, and I do one a week, so 52 weeks. The end of episode 52 was the first shot at Lexington. So I went an entire year without actually talking about the war in a podcast about the war. So yeah, I really wanted to start with the French and Indian War because as much as people don't know about the American Revolution, they know even less about the French and Indian War, which was really um, the cause of the political disputes which eventually led to the American Revolution, all started as a result of the French and Indian War. Um, the French and Indian War was um, fought obviously between the British colonies and the French and their Indian allies, but it led to a much larger world war, which was known as the 7 Years' War. So usually the war that took place in the Americas was the French and Indian War. The war that took place in Europe was the 7 Years' War. And that actually did take 7 years over there because we got started a couple years earlier over here. One of the most interesting aspects of it is that George Washington started the French and Indian War. And that was really kind of his origin story. He was a young kid who, because he came from a prominent family, got a choice military position to go out and basically tell the French people to get off our lawn up in the Ohio area where Virginia claimed all that land. And he ended up picking a fight with the French, which ended up starting a world war. And I think Washington does not come across particularly well in that war because not only does he start an entire war, he spends most of the war fighting with the British officers that he's serving under, because he wants Virginia to get an advantage out of the war rather than Pennsylvania. And he ends up kind of quitting halfway through and just going home and settling on Vernon. So yeah, that's kind of an interesting aspect of the war. The other interesting thing is that the French and Indian War in America really became a sideshow to the larger 7 Years' War. And the French were really kicking our butts throughout the early part of that war. And it was really only after the British Navy cut off the French from being able to reach Quebec that things really turned around for the British and their American colonial allies. So yeah, it was an interesting thing. And there's a lot of generals who fight in the American Revolution that played a pretty important role in the French and Indian War. I think the Battle of the Monongahela, there's probably at least a dozen officers who end up fighting on one of the other sides of the American Revolution. So it's kind of an interesting prequel to the whole war. And then, yeah, of course, we went through that and then into the tax protests over that were basically written as a result of wanting to get out of the debt for the French and Indian War. Then those tax protests, of course, eventually led to the American Revolution.
Well, then 1 year later, and 54 episodes, I think later, then you touch base on Lexington and Concord. I find the first 50, 100 episodes of your podcast amazing, because and by the way, when you tune into Mike's podcast, don't start with the topic that you really like. Start with number one and go down, because it will really enlighten you and put things into a better perspective on how all things kind of took place. And then a year after that, you're talking about the Declaration of Independence. So when I say detailed and thorough, that's what I'm talking about. Regarding Lexington and Concord, I just did a show on that. I tried to walk people through an immersive, as much as you can do via voice, on what it might have been like to be in the militia there. Is there, I'll ask you a similar question. Is there a person, event, or a moment at Lexington and Concord that stands out to you? Albeit both of those were in one day, a lot happened. Is there anything regarding that you want to share?
Yeah, well, the Battle of Lexington and Concord is really interesting because it didn't just happen in Lexington and Concord. There was basically a running firefight from Boston all the way out to Concord and then all the way back again. So there wasn't really one big battle or even two battles. There were hundreds of little skirmishes fought that day. I kind of analogize it to kicking over a hornet's wasp and then having to run across the field 2 or 3 times. That's what it was like for the British. They were constantly getting, a shot here, shot there, trying to fight off whoever was shooting at them, only to have somebody shoot at them from the other side of the road. And it was a complete nightmare for them. For the Americans, it was pretty much chaos. Everybody had kind of expected something like this was going to happen at some point. They had all thought about turning out to fight the British when the British finally did fire on Americans. And that's really what happened. There was no big army that formed immediately. It was a bunch of people running out of their houses with their guns, taking pot shots at the enemy, and then running away before the enemy could kill them. One of the people who always stands out to me is Samuel Whittemore, who was an 80-year-old man at the time. He got the message that the British were on the march, that they had shot at people at Lexington. He sent his family to safety, pulled out his musket, and went off and said he's going to shoot himself a couple of British soldiers. And that's exactly what he did. He ran down to the road that he knew the British were going to pass by, found a good position, took shots at a few of them. The British, of course, chased him down and shot him and bayoneted him, and he took out a few with his pistols as they were charging him, but they totally creamed him and left him for dead. amazingly, he survived with over 17 bayonet wounds and bullet wounds. And the 80-year-old man lived well into his 90s and survived the whole thing. But he's kind of an interesting example of somebody who just, was willing to put his life on the line. He wasn't being called out and ordered to go stand in a line with the militia. He just said, we have to show them that their treatment of us is unacceptable. And if I lay down my life as a result, so be it.
The Battle of Monotony, which was kind of brutal, and the bloody trail back. It's so cool because I have all this stuff in my mind and I try to share it, to others. But when I'm speaking with somebody that's so well more versed in everything, it's really nice, because I'm like, yeah. And like everyone's like so tired of hearing me talk about, at least at home. I love it. All right, so we're gonna do some rapid fire questions, and rapid fire means, that's a fancy way of saying random. You do not have to answer these fast. Take as much time as you want, and maybe we'll have a discussion with them. So the first question is, in your opinion, do you think the topic, documentary, podcast, show, whatever, of the American Revolution is gaining momentum, status quo, or losing ground in this country? And why do you feel the way that you do?
Well, I think the American Revolution has always been overshadowed by other events, particularly the Civil War, World War II, or much more popular wars. We got a boost in the American Revolution as a result of the musical Hamilton. I think that kind of put the era back in the popular mind. That's obviously beginning to fade a bit now, but I think we're right in a trough right now that's going to go up again, because we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of a lot of these events. And there's a whole lot of movies and documentaries and other things that are in the works right now that we're going to see released over the next couple of years, and books, lots and lots of books coming out, all to celebrate the sesquicentennial of the war. And I think that'll be really interesting.
Yeah. Do you have any ancestor? Are you a member of the Sons of the American Revolution?
I'm not a member, but I do have ancestors who served in the Pennsylvania Associators.
Oh, wow. Well, you need to become a member, or recommend it. My ancestor, Peter Kern, he fought out of Pennsylvania. And I'm so jealous of your location. I'm here in Idaho. And we're members of Mount Vernon, which doesn't make any logical sense to most people, but we want to support Mount Vernon. And you have so much history close by to you. It's just, I mean, I don't think I could get anything done if I moved to the east, because I would just be going from battlefield to battlefield to battlefield to museum. I love all of them. Have you visited most of those, or do you find yourself like, maybe today I'll take a break from the recording and I'm just going to go visit Valley Forge, or Princeton and Trenton? Or have you already been there and done that?
I've been to a lot of them. I love going back again and again, because there's always things that you didn't see when you're there for a few hours one time or another. So yeah, there's plenty to see. Yeah, there's probably, I can think of 40 or 50 interesting sites within an hour's drive of where I live. So yeah, there's always a lot to do, and it's very fascinating to go see. I actually, until recently, worked in Philadelphia, and I spent most of my working career working across the street from Independence Hall. And within 2 or 3 blocks of there are so many different things. The Bank of the U.S., the Bank of North America, Carpenter's Hall, Washington Square, where the Tomb of the Unknown American Revolution Soldier is, the Betsy Ross House, the Ben Franklin House, the Jefferson House, all within like 3 blocks of where I was living. So I would go out every day at lunch and just wander around and check out something new, or spend time somewhere looking at things. It was a great experience.
I wish I just, we have a long journey to do that, but man, I envy you on that for sure. You're right. I mean, it's just, and being there, as opposed to even watching it on video and reading about it, which is great. But physically being somewhere where something historical took place, I just don't know if there is a substitute for that. It just has an air of, I don't know, it's just extra special.
Lowe's knows that free is just better. That's why MyLowe's Rewards is free to join. As a member, you earn points towards MyLowe's money on eligible purchases, get exclusive free gifts, and earn free shipping at Silver Key status, all on top of weekly member-only deals. Don't wait. Join MyLowe's Rewards for free today and start saving more. Lowe's, we help, you save. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
And getting back to how you mentioned the 250th anniversary, and a lot of books coming out. I'm on a big screen, so I can't show you every book in my 2 library deals is all also American Revolution. And do you prefer, I think I know the answer, but do you prefer the physical book versus, staring at your phone and or a Kindle or something like that?
I do prefer books because I can have 6 of them open at times, different pages, and be looking at different things. And until they make a good e-paper thing that has a screen that's more than 6 inches tall, I'm going to have a real book.
Yeah, I love the book too. I hope that the younger kids don't forget about books. They're a precious commodity these days with everything kind of going digital. Excuse me. All right. What is your overall opinion on Benedict Arnold? I know that's like an open-ended 3-hour conversation, but a lot of people have different views.
Yeah, no, I'd say he's probably the most fascinating character of the war for a lot of reasons. He's really an interesting guy. And he was, I would say, the best battlefield commander that the Americans had for several years. He did some amazing stuff. He almost single-handedly kept the British in Canada for about 2 years, which, if they had been able to get out any sooner, would have been a nightmare for the Americans. I sometimes compare him to General Patton in World War II. He was just that. He was an amazingly good fighter and did not work and play well with others.
That's a great analogy because, for perspective, people always say, Benedict Arnold synonymous with traitor. He just went to the other side. But in your analogy, that would have been like Patton switching to the other side, which would have been a catastrophe and a big deal. Was it as big as that to the other generals and George Washington and people involved?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, it would have been like Patton going over the Nazis. And there's some conspiracy theories out there that argue that Patton was like almost wanting America to do that because they wanted to fight the Russian communists, which were coming up as the next enemy. But obviously he did not do that. He was a loyal American and stayed so. But Benedict Arnold did not. Benedict Arnold not only betrayed his country, but betrayed the men that were under his command. His plan was to surrender West Point, where he was the commander, and surrender an army of up to maybe 3,000 soldiers who were relying on him to be a loyal and good commander. Those men would have gone into prison ships and probably would have died slow, horrible, lingering deaths as a result. So he was really, at a really basic level, betraying those who put their greatest trust in them, not to mention his country and his fellow officers and George Washington, who he also was going to turn over to the enemy. It was really a horrific act of betrayal. And despite all the wonderful things he did in the first few years of the war, you can say he's a wonderful battlefield commander, which he was, but his sense of honor was nothing after that. And you really can't overlook the good after all the bad that he did.
Yeah, for sure. Obviously, I think I have a question here about Turn, Washington Spies, AMC. I think it's on Prime now. We just watched it for I don't know how many times. They kind of portray Benedict Arnold doing amazing things, right? Saratoga didn't listen to orders and pretty much won that battle because of him, primarily. But do you think, he wasn't promoted because there was a certain allotment per state, and his state was already full. He then married or started dating the most attractive woman in all of the colonies, Miss Shippen, and they kind of portray it like she was maybe feeding some, what, your country isn't giving you a promotion and isn't really appreciating your efforts and all of that. Do you, and I think the Shippens were pretty much known as opposing the war and kind of more Tory. What impact do you think that, and maybe you've come across some proof or maybe it's just speculation, either way is fine, but what do you think her impact on him switching sides did she have? And also, why do you think, or what things led up to him saying, enough's enough, I've done X, Y, and Z, nobody appreciates me, I'm done? What's your input on that?
Well, it's hard to argue that he wasn't promoted enough. I mean, he did get promoted a lot more slowly than he would have liked, but he was a major general, which was the highest rank in the army behind George Washington by the time he switched sides. He did feel like he was being treated unfairly in a lot of different ways, and he was wounded very seriously at Saratoga and several other times. But after Saratoga, I think he lost about 3 inches on one leg. He walked with a terrible limp, and had a really rough time. Like many other officers, he also spent a great deal of his personal money to support some of the military campaigns that he had fought, with the expectation that Congress would eventually pay him back for all these expenses. And Congress, of course, had no money and had no desire to make any repayments, and often tried to find ways to rip off the people who had donated their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to the cause. So he felt very betrayed by that. When the British left Philadelphia after their occupation in 78, he became the military governor of Philadelphia. And in that role, Washington actually, and several military and congressional leaders told him, what we want you to do is make nice with all the loyalists and Tories that are in Philadelphia, get them back to work, producing things for the war effort, because most of the loyalists were not, I wouldn't say they were, supporters of the king do or die. They were rich merchants who thought the king is eventually going to win this thing, and we want to come out with royal favor and not be have our property seized and our people thrown in our family thrown in the street. They were looking to be on the winning side, and so Arnold's job was really to convince them that the Americans were winning and they needed to back the Americans and support the war effort and start producing the much needed supplies that the Continental Army needed. The people in Philadelphia felt very differently about that. They were like, these are the people who were kissing up to the British while the British were in town, destroying our city and killing our people and doing all sorts of horrible things to us. We should be imprisoning these people, not, going to tea parties with them like Arnold was. And so there was a lot of hostility toward Arnold. And it really wasn't, as I said, Arnold was ordered to do this by the Continental Congress and by George Washington. It wasn't like he was just being nice to the Tories. And of course, at this time, he met the Shippens, met 18-year-old Peggy and convinced her to marry him, which of course also did not endear him to the radical patriots. And they actually one of the things Arnold did was try to make some money while he was military governor. He had a lot of property that he was supposed to be seizing, and he would tell these merchants that were going to have their property seized, hey, I'm going to seize your property, but tell you what, I'll give you 30 cents on the dollar. I'll buy it from you, and then we won't have to seize it. How's that sound? So he was pulling deals like that. And the president of Pennsylvania ended up demanding that they first tried to prosecute him, and the Continental Congress said no, he can only be tried by a military court. And so he insisted on Arnold being court-martialed, which he was. They really didn't find him guilty of much more than bad judgment, and ordered Washington to give him a reprimand, which he did. He basically said, bad, Arnold, don't do it again. Washington's view in the whole thing was, all right, you did some stuff which people think were a little slimy, but you're a great officer. I'm going to say this is bad. Then I'm going to give you this great position in the Army. You're going to win some major battle for us, and you'll be a hero once again, and everybody will forget about this bad business. Arnold kind of decided, no, I'm sick of you guys. I've given everything, and all you do is take and badmouth me and make me into this horrible person. The British had approached a great many American officers trying to turn them, and most of them, kicked the person out of their house or even had them prosecuted as traitors. Arnold was receptive to it, and he went along with it. And I'm sure Peggy was a part of that. As I said, he was hanging out with a lot of Tories in Philadelphia, not just Peggy, but her father and brother and people like that.
Yeah.
They obviously had an influence on him, and convinced him that this was not a terrible thing to do. In fact, it was probably the right thing to do, and that probably had some influence on him.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I never really thought about other generals being courted, so to speak, about trying to turn them. I guess I never thought. That's an interesting point. Of course, it always goes right back to Benedict Arnold, who had a pretty good-sized ego. But on one hand, you can kind of see where he's at, but on the other hand, you're like you mentioned, I mean, you go to the prison ships, 95% or so ain't coming off alive. So that would have been disastrous. Plus, West Point was so critical location-wise. Had Arnold succeeded in giving up West Point, getting rid of 3,000, what do you think would have happened? Would that have been game over for the Continental Army at that point?
I don't think so. I think the British saw this as being some great victory. Imagine that they had taken over West Point. Their goal was to, throughout the first 3 or 4 years of the war, was to create this connection between New York and Quebec, and basically cut off all of New England from the rest of the colonies, and then deal with these troublesome New Englanders. The problem is that by the time this happened in 1780, the war had spread throughout all 13 colonies. There was hostility to the British everywhere. And there was no way in heck that the British were going to create this defensive line that somehow cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. They could have a fort at West Point, but people could just walk, 50 miles upriver and cross there and never be detected. So I'm not sure it would be this whole thing. And West Point was also pretty far inland, and anytime the British tried to set up an outpost further inland from their naval forces and that stuff, it just created a new target for the Americans to take on. So I think even if you had a whole bunch of the Army captured there, you would have had a whole bunch of New England militia be raised, and they would have gone and they would have attacked West Point, and they would have taken it right back. So I'm not sure what it really accomplished.
Interesting. Okay. Obviously, most people think that was the big thing. Maybe it's just because of the whole story, because then obviously, he hooks up with John Andre and they promise 20 grand. And then Benedict Arnold says, well, you need to give me 10 more grand because I'll give you Washington. I mean, when you're willing to give up George Washington, of all people, let alone 3,000, soldiers that would have probably died. And yeah, you feel sorry for Arnold briefly and kind of understand, but then you think of what he was doing. Then
when you start selling off your comrades in arms, that's got to be pretty despicable.
that's
And I got to say, Arnold did donate a lot to the cause, but so did 100 other major officers, and they didn't turn, even though they were being equally screwed by Congress.
yeah, for sure. And I don't know, Congress back then didn't have any money. They, made decisions agonizing slow. So I guess nothing's really changed from then to today. All right, so that's Benedict Arnold. What is your, if you can pin it down, your favorite historical location relating to the American Revolution? Since you live by so many, is there one that you just, if I had to go to only one, it would be this?
Well, personally, I grew up near Brandywine Battlefield, so that always holds a personal place in my heart that I really love to go back to again and again. More generally, as I said, there's a lot of stuff along the Delaware River. Washington's Crossing is always a very nice place, and you can follow the trail from there to Trenton and Princeton, and there's a lot of interesting stuff to see up there as well.
Washington, yeah, my wife and I went to Washington's Crossing, and then we drove across the bridge, and for some reason we didn't go along the trail to go up to Princeton and Trenton. I'm just kicking myself, but that is a good excuse for us to go back.
Yeah, I always like to joke, crossing the Delaware is not that big a deal. I do it twice a day, but going into Trenton at night, that takes some nerve.
For sure. All right, so if you had to pin it down to maybe the top one or two people on the British side, who do you think was most important, or who had the most impact on the war itself? I'm kind of asking you unfair questions because there's a lot involved, but who do you think the most important person or persons were on the British side?
Well, you had a lot of military commanders over the course of the war. I mean, you started with Gage, and then you had General Howe, and then General Clinton, and even General Carleton was the commander for a little time at the end there. In some ways, if you want to go with the cliche, I would say King George III was an important personality in all this. A lot of people say, oh, well, the king really didn't have much influence on things at this time. He was more of an honorary figurehead sort of guy. George III was not. He was actually pretty actively involved, especially behind the scenes. He was a strong supporter of putting down this rebellion through military force rather than compromise. He really, when the war got tough, especially after Saratoga and France joined the war, a lot of British politicians really said, let's just settle this American thing, give them independence, who cares, let's be done with it. George III was the one who really said, no, we cannot give up these colonies. We have to keep pushing to win this war. If we don't win the war, the empire's dead. And he really almost single-handedly kept Lord North in place as prime minister when a lot of people wanted to get rid of him, when Lord North tried to resign 2 or 3 times, because the king knew that if he was replaced, he would be replaced by a peace candidate who was going to end the war. So George III played a big role. If I wanted to pick somebody else, I'd probably go with General Howe, only because I think he had the best chance to win the war early on and really blew it. And to be fair to him, we're looking at it in hindsight and can see exactly what he did wrong. There were good reasons for why he did what he did, but I think if you want to blame the big person who really lost the war for the British, I would go with General Howe.
Okay, and same question: who do you think was the most important on the American side?
Well, again, I think the cliche answer is the right one, which is George Washington, who's obviously the most famous person to come out of this era. And for a long time, I kind of thought, all right, he must be overhyped. Is usually the case. You find that this was really more of a, hundreds of people contributed to the overall victory, which of course people did. But the more I read, the more I really accepted the idea that Washington, to use another author's phrase, really was the indispensable man, that this revolution would not have happened without him. He was not the best strategist. He was not the best tactician, although he was very brave in battle. But he was not the best field commander. He was not probably the fifth or sixth best field commander that the Americans had. But his ability to maintain an army that would be obedient to Congress, no matter how irresponsible Congress got, to insist on the civilian rule, to insist that this country become a democratic republic rather than him becoming dictator of some independent country, were all things that a lot of people did not expect to happen, that were very unusual course of events for revolutions. And I think George Washington was the man who made all that happen. And then not to mention the fact that he took some really incredible military risks at certain times, which saved the war effort. So I have to go with George Washington.
I would agree. I would definitely agree. And you've mentioned it several times on a variety of different episodes. I think people think of the founding fathers, George Washington, John Jay, Adams, Jefferson, and the rest. It's so long ago, and we just have no audio. We don't have a picture. We just have paintings, which some of them are quite lifelike. We do have a life mask of several of them, but it's we forget that they had families, they had wives, they had anger. George Washington, although he was extraordinary at keeping it in check, he had a pretty vicious temper, and I think we just forget about that these people were human. David McCullough always, mentioned that, history is about men, and they weren't just robots, and they're not just on Mount Rushmore or a dollar bill. And I think it's important for people to realize that. I love how you have mentioned that in your show. It's just so easy to say, oh, you know what, George Washington, he was rich, he owned slaves, he just did what he had to do, and he won. And I'm like, oh, do you have 7 hours? Because I'm ready to talk to you, right? And then they leave and they go, Ron's going to talk about the revolution again.
And that's the thing. You have some people that'll treat these founders like they're marble statues and perfect and gods in every way. And then you'll inevitably have the other side, which will say, oh, these were illegal slave owners who did horrible things, or were maintaining a patriarchy and, did all these other things. And you're right, the answer is always somewhere in the middle. These were human beings. They had good aspects to their lives. They had bad aspects to their lives. I don't judge people today. Certainly don't want to judge historical figures whose shoes I really can't stand in. But my goal is to try to understand why they did what they did. And to the extent we judge them, I think we have to look at what was society like when they were born, and what was society like when they died, and did they have a major positive or negative impact on society? And these people, in my opinion, had a huge positive impact on society. Was America perfect once they founded it in the 1790s? No, it had its problems, and it continued to grow. And we tried to form a more perfect union over generations. But they're the ones who started it. They're the ones who set the bar for where we are today.
Well said.
Hey, it's Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast, here to tell you about Michelob Ultra Courtside. It's getting fans closer to the NBA with a chance to win prizes like courtside seats, a trip to All-Star Weekend, and much more. Check it out at MichelobUltra.com/courtside. Michelob Ultra Superior Access, Courtside 24-25 sweepstakes, no purchase necessary. Open to U.S. residents 21 and up. Begins on October 1st, 2024, ends July 1st, 2025. Multiple entry periods. Visit MichelobUltra.com/courtside for free entry deadlines, and official rules. Message and data rates may apply. Void where prohibited.
What do you think about when you hear the Declaration of Independence? A little late because it's July 4th, obviously, or 2nd. But what do you think about when you hear or read the Declaration of Independence?
Well, they didn't sign it till August 2nd, so we're still in that time period. Yeah, I mean, the Declaration could have been a nothing, and most people thought it was going to be a nothing when they decided who was going to write it, because they gave it to a very junior congressman who they knew was a decent writer, but not much else, Thomas Jefferson. They could have simply wrote down in a piece of paper, "We, the 13 colonies, hereby declare our independence from King George and Great Britain, signed John Hancock." That could have been the end of it. Obviously, they took it a lot more seriously than that, and what Jefferson really set out to do was explain what they believed in and why the British government, and specifically the king, was not living up to what they expected from a government. And when they said things like, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. I mean, we seem to think that's really nice words these days, and maybe they didn't completely live up to them in all aspects of their lives, but they were just nice words. Those were radical words. Those were crazy words for people living in Europe at the time. I mean, men were not created equal. There were aristocrats and there were commoners, and they had very different rights under the law. And they had, there were no such things as fundamental rights. You fought for what you got in this world. Government was not there to protect fundamental rights. Government was a power to rule over you, and it would give you some benefits to its negatives in order to keep you in line and think, all right, well, this is better than the alternative, I'll stick with it. The idea that there were basic fundamental freedoms and rights that no legitimate government could not protect was a very radical idea in 1776. And the fact that they were just saying, well, these are just self-evident truths, they're just obvious to us, was a very radical stand at the time. I think it's something that's proven very right over the next few centuries, and something we've tried to live up to over that time, with sometimes greater or lesser success. But I think, again, they set the bar that we've been trying to live up to since then.
I always get asked the question, especially from the students that my wife and I teach. They say, well, how could Thomas Jefferson write that all men are created equal when he owned over 600 slaves? And what would your answer be to that? Because, here he is writing this down, we're all equal. They knew that in writing this, I would assume, how do you say that when you go back to Monticello and you have 600 slaves over the course of his lifetime, I guess? But what's your position on when people throw the curveball or try to say, how do you support the founding fathers? They wrote this, but then they went back to their slaves. Do you have a good answer or reply to that?
Well, I would say that nobody really thought slavery was wrong a generation before the American Revolution. People always say, oh, well, the Quakers opposed slavery. No, they didn't. William Penn had slaves. I've read actually a story, I think from the 1750s, where a group of Quakers kicked out one of their members because he wouldn't stop talking about trying to end slavery, and they just thought that was ridiculous. So everybody supported slavery. It was a normal thing, and it was part of an overall society, which is you are born into a station in life and you live that life. If you're born as a noble, you're a nobleman. If you're born as a commoner, you're born as a commoner. If you're born as a slave, you're born as a slave, and you live as a slave. These were considered completely non-controversial things. What the American Revolution started was the idea that, well, yeah, this is the way the world is, but is it the way the world should be? And what we are setting here is what we think the way the world should be. Now, they were really thinking about the idea of the rights of colonists versus the rights of British people when they wrote all men are created equal. But almost immediately, you see a lot of people saying, well, if we really believe that, can we really have slavery? And the anti-slave movement grew very directly out of the American Revolution. And 7 of the 13 states ended slavery within a few years, or at least put it on the road to being abolished in their state within a few years of the end of the American Revolution. And I can't imagine that they would have done that had we not had that revolution and had these words that we put out there, again, setting the bar for something that needs to change. Thomas Jefferson himself became very anti-slavery later in life. He did not give up slavery, free his own slaves, because it would have destroyed him financially to do so. And you can say that's a failing, sure, but how many of us would give up all of our life savings and everything we own for a principle? It's a difficult thing to ask of anyone. And so while, it would have been nice if he'd done it, we can certainly understand why he didn't. But again, it was the principles that he wrote about that gave rise to the abolition movement that eventually ended slavery. And, it ended slavery. Well, I mean, people say, oh, well, Britain ended slavery and America still had it. Well, Britain didn't end slavery until the 1830s. The abolition movement that grew out of the Declaration of Independence took hold in Britain as well. And it took hold in France, and it took hold in a lot of other places where slavery was the accepted norm. They were changing these ideas. And people say, well, if they really changed ideas, why didn't they just change it?
Oh, did I lose you?
As we've seen in other revolutions, like the French Revolution, and disaster, and everybody, usually millions of people die as a result. The framers understood that change takes time, and that you can't just change everything overnight with the flick of a pen. They started a process that they knew would take a long time to happen, and it did take a long time to happen, but it did happen. And a lot of other places that tried to change too much too fast devolved into a nightmare for everyone.
Chaos, yeah. Well said. It was normal back then, and I think it's unfair and unwise and really impossible to compare where you are today, 1800, 1700, 16. You can't compare histories that are centuries apart, because
well, let me give you a modern example. This may sound a little crazy, but it's something I've been thinking about.
I like it.
Right now, they're developing a way to produce meat by growing cells in a petri dish as opposed to raising and killing animals. I suspect that if this is successful in a generation or two, people will look back on the idea of raising and massacring animals for our personal food and pleasure as being a horrific thing. But right now, we don't think of it that way. It's perfectly normal. And, if I think about a poor cow being massacred killed in a slaughterhouse, it's not a pleasant thought to me, but it's not going to stop me from eating a hamburger either. So I'm living with a bit of a contradiction there, in that I see the pain that is being caused by the process, but I'm not really willing to give up my own comforts in life to change that, even though it would be nice if that change could happen. And as I said, when slaughtering animals maybe is no longer necessary 50 years from now, people may look back on me and say, well, Mike, come on, there were vegetarians at your time. Why didn't you become a vegetarian? There were lots of arguments that you yourself said that, this is kind of a cruel process. Why did you continue to live with it? All I can say is, well, I do. And it's the norm in the society in which I live. And don't hold me to a standard that becomes normal 50 or 100 years from now.
I like that. That's a very good example. Especially since we raise our own beef here, it makes it even a little more difficult. But if people had to actually raise and grow and process their own meat, you'd have a lot more appreciation for it. But I love that example. It's very well said. Putting on our trench coats and sunglasses and our sneaky hat and breaking out the invisible ink. The most widely known, probably because of Turn, is a group of spies called the Culper Spy Ring. Do you have any input or stories about the Culper Spy Ring that you like to share, or that maybe isn't talked about very much, then isn't widely known?
Well, as we've already noted, much of the Culper Spy Ring that we do know about is, in popular knowledge at least, is from the AMC's Turn, the TV show. And I think they actually did a pretty good job with it. I mean, there are obviously some discrepancies, but the Culper Spy Ring was kind of an evolution in how espionage worked during the war. Early in the war, Washington, who had, as I said, very, very little command experience, I don't think appreciated the need for intelligence as important as it was. And when he did try to get it, he did it very poorly, as Nathan Hale found out the hard way. So we see kind of the Americans trying to find a better way to gather intelligence without putting their operatives at risk. And the Culper Spy Ring was a big part of that. Colonel Talmadge, who became the head of the ring for the Continental Army, was from Long Island, which was occupied by the British for almost the entire war. And he was able to go back and contact childhood friends that he knew and trusted implicitly to be a part of this ring, which meant that he could do this without setting up a bunch of double agents within the ring. And they did a pretty impressive job with getting information from behind British lines to directly to the commander-in-chief.
I can't remember who it was, but I remember reading somewhere that a British officer years after said there is no way that Washington and his army could have won without the intelligence that was discovered through spies. Obviously, there was more than just the Culper Spy Ring, but would you agree with that statement of that British officer, or have you heard that before?
Well, espionage is obviously very important to any military campaign. Knowing what your enemy is going to do, where they're going to attack, when they're going to attack, can make your life so much easier than trying to defend everywhere all at once. So yeah, I mean, they did provide a good deal of helpful information. It's hard to judge a counterfactual. If they didn't exist, would the Americans still have done okay? There were a couple of really critical times when the Culper Spy Ring was especially helpful. For one of I think the most critical was when the French first arrived in Newport, Rhode Island. The British were going to go up and attack them, and if they had attacked immediately, the French were in pretty horrible shape. Most of their men were recovering from seasicknesses and stuff, and they were just in really miserable condition when they first arrived. They would not have done well with a British attack, and they needed weeks to build defenses up properly too. Washington found out they were going to do this through this Culper Spy Ring, and he was able to get counterintelligence back to the British saying the Americans were planning an attack on New York, and he ended up moving some troops onto just above northern Manhattan to make it look like he really was going to make an attack. And so the British called off their attack of the French and instead reinforced their defenses on Manhattan to prevent this American attack, which of course never came. So that was, if the French had been captured or the French army had been destroyed right after it landed, that certainly would have been disastrous, and we never would have had a successful Yorktown campaign.
And I like how Washington, and I suppose I just read his own writing of Talmadge, and it was just, kind of cool to have his own words, but he just time and time again, I went in and talked with Washington, and I'm like, if I could sit down with Washington, that would be really cool. But he also used disinformation, and made sure that it got into the enemy's hands to either send them to a different area or think that we were doing X when we were actually doing Y. Spying is probably in every war. And it's nothing new. It wasn't created for the revolution, but some cool stuff came out of it with invisible ink and a variety of other things. So, all right. So if you could, go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the things that's really interesting to me
Yeah.
is that you can see how much of an amateur Washington really was in 1775 when he started doing this, and how much of an amazing expert he was in this by 1783 when the war ended. And just his personal growth, especially not only in military strategy, but in espionage specifically. You can see how much the man grew and improved over time as a result of what he was going through.
Well, and I think, like you said, he wasn't the best tactician. He probably maybe wasn't even in the top 5 as far as battlefield generals. But one thing that he was good at is listening and taking input and feedback from everybody, and then taking all that information and making a final decision. One thing that's one thing to strive for. All right, so this is going to be a tough question. Well, maybe not. I know my answer. But if you could sit down with one person from the revolution, who would it be, and what would you ask them, or what would you want to know if you had that opportunity to sit down with anybody from the revolution?
I know you just mentioned George Washington, and of course that would be a really interesting discussion, you'd think. I would love to be able to get into his head on a whole bunch of different things. One of the things about Washington was that he was extremely guarded and almost never let anyone know, not even his closest friends, really know what he was thinking. So I'm not sure having a discussion with him would be as fruitful as we would like. We would like to get all sorts of stuff, and he would probably mostly change the topic and avoid answering the questions the way we wanted. So yeah, if I was going to sit down with someone, probably someone like Samuel Adams would be really interesting, just because he was such a big part of starting the war and understanding where he thought things were really going at that time, as opposed to where they actually went. He was also a big opponent of the Constitution when it came out, and I would like to really have a talk with him about why he thought that that was such a danger to society.
Good stuff. So I like the fact in your podcast that you talk about people that made a large impact, made a big difference in our independence, but they're not the most known. They're not founding fathers. Is there a person or a group of people that isn't widely known or discussed often that you feel deserves to be spoken more about?
One of my favorite unsung characters is someone almost no one has ever heard of unless they listen to my podcast, and that's Jemima Warner. She was a young teenage wife of a Continental soldier who marched off with the army in 1775 at the very beginning of the war. And her husband was part of a group of Pennsylvania riflemen who were attached to Benedict Arnold's army that did the march across the Maine wilderness to attack Quebec from the other side. That march was a disaster. Most of the army that had been under Arnold turned back and just said it was too hard, we'll never make it across. Arnold eventually later tried to have them court-martialed for disobeying orders and turning back, and the court-martial acquitted them, saying that conditions were too harsh. No man could be expected to go through that. But a portion of the army did get through, and Jemima Warner was part of that portion that did get through. Many of the men starved and died along the way. They were forced to eat their dogs, to eat their own shoe leather, to get across the wilderness. Jemima Warner's husband died during that march, and she left the army behind to bury him. And then when he was buried, she picked up his gun and marched, caught up with the army, and continued on the march. Nobody would have thought any less of her if she had turned around and gone home at that point, but she didn't. She stuck with the army, and when they reached Quebec, they actually sent her to the front gates to demand the surrender. And General Gage inside actually took her prisoner, threw her in a dungeon, and said, "This is ridiculous." They eventually turned her back over to the Americans, who were maintaining a siege outside. She spent most of her time supporting the soldiers. She was not a combatant, but she would bring water and ammunition and those things to the front lines, for the men who were, putting herself in great danger, so much in great danger that a British soldier eventually shot her in the head and killed her.
Mm.
She led an amazing, heroic life, and no one in the world has ever heard of her.
Mm. Well, I'll make sure I find that episode that you talked to her, and I'll put that link for sure.
But it's actually the very first episode I did of Unlearned History was on her, and I go into the reasons why she's not remembered too. It's I
Okay.
thought it was interesting. If you can bear with the technical horrors of my podcasting ability in my very first episode, but the subject matter I think is interesting.
Yeah.
Somebody else who I always thought really deserves a lot more credit is John Laurens. His father, Henry Laurens, was president of the Continental Congress at one point, and at that time, John Laurens was a aide-de-camp to George Washington, and he was actually a critical connection between his father and Washington during the Conway Cabal, when they were thinking about replacing Washington with another general. So he had a really critical role there. In addition to that, he was just always showing bravery. He was at the forefront of everything. His two best buddies in the war were Alexander Hamilton and Marquis de Lafayette, who we all know much better than him. He was an amazing soldier. His father was also a major slave trader in South Carolina before the war. And during the course of the war, John Laurens became a staunch abolitionist and called for the end of slavery, and actually wanted to arm South Carolina slaves and form a regiment of black soldiers, which he was not able to do given the politics in South Carolina at the time. But that's who he was. He was really a man who was seeing the future of this country and the freedom and equality that we needed to adopt, and was ready to embrace that. Unfortunately, he was killed in 1782 in a minor skirmish. I think if he had lived through the war, he would have been an amazing Southern voice for abolition, and this country may have evolved in a very different way than the way it did.
John Laurens.
Yeah.
I think on my last episode, I play a bit that I found on, I think Mark Price did it. He goes around to a group of people outside and just asks them random questions about the American Revolution. And it was funny at first, and then it was not so funny because people didn't know who we were fighting. And it was kind of insane. Like, I'm like, oh, people, even if you're not a nerd about the American Revolution, we are all abiding by, or should be, the documents that were created by these founding fathers. So even if history is not your bag, I think at minimum you would want to know about what took place and the people behind those documents, which this country is founded. And it just drives me nuts. I don't expect anybody to, go do a podcast or, study it exclusively, but you should know it. And I think many public schools are kind of bypassing the revolution. They're taking out World War I and II, and who knows what's really being taught. Is there anything that you want to set the record straight on about the American Revolution that you might read or hear and you're like, that's wrong, that's wrong? Is there anything that stands out? You may or may not have an idea of one, but
Well, what you say is right, and it's an unfortunate result that schools don't really teach history well. They'll give you a few basic facts, and you're right, that you're lucky if they spend a week on the American Revolution, and probably most of that's on the Constitutional Convention. And I get it. There's a lot to get through, and what they end up teaching is a few facts and make it very bland and uninteresting, and people get totally bored with it. The reality is that history, not just the American Revolution, all of history is made up of really fascinating stories involving sex and violence and all sorts of interesting things that people really don't learn about. And if they take the time to get into it, everybody says truth is stranger than fiction. It really is. If you read a piece of fiction that has some unbelievable thing in it, it just becomes stupid to you. If you read something that really happened and still was this unbelievable fact, like the fact that when Washington was trying to escape from Long Island to New York after the British had him pinned down, and there was just this huge storm that kept the dark, through the entire morning, so the British couldn't see him, and a wind that kept the British ships away. If you wrote that in a book of fiction, you'd be like, "Oh, that's just silly. That would never happen." Well, it did happen, and the fact that it did, it makes it just that much more interesting. So, yeah, there's a lot.
Weather played a role in several instances,
That's just one example. But
which you're right. I mean, the truth is, it's insane. Is there something that's always out there, or that's something that you always hear that, like, people, like, this is a bad example, but George Washington had wooden teeth and he cut down the cherry tree? Both of those.
There's some of that, which most people know are just stories. But one of the biggest misconceptions, I guess, that I find is that we fought the American Revolution over high taxes. It had nothing to do with the level of taxes. Taxes in the colonies were actually lower than they were in Britain. What it had to do with was, we've all heard the phrase taxation without representation. The idea was Parliament did not have the right to tax the colonies because the colonies were not represented in Parliament. And the reason behind that, that's not just a line. The reason behind that was you have to have the ability to vote out people who are taking your property away from you, or else there is nothing to prevent them from taking more and more property over time. So even if they just passed a very small tax right now, that tax could grow much, much larger in a generation or two. And, the people were able to see what was happening in other parts of the British Empire, where basically all the wealth gets sucked out of a region. People are left on bare subsistence. And then when there's a problem like, the Irish famine, or there was another famine in Bangladesh at the time of the revolution, millions of people just starved to death because they'd extracted all the excess wealth out of there. And that's what the Americans were trying to prevent from happening. Not that taxes were high now, but that they had the right to control their own destiny. And that's what they wanted to do. I mean, think about it today. Say next week, the United Nations imposed a tax on all Americans. It was a very small tax. Maybe it cost you $1 a year or something. And it was being used for a very good purpose, to help people that were starving to death somewhere. Our objection would not be on the level of taxes. Our objection would not be on what the taxes were being used for. The objection would be the United Nations does not have the right to just impose a tax on Americans by force. And that's what the American colonists thought that the British Parliament was doing to them.
Excellent. Let's fast forward to the last major battle, or siege, or both, that it became, that being Yorktown. Once you reach Yorktown in your podcast, is that where you think your show is going to end? Do you have plans on maybe going past Yorktown, following the turmoil, maybe the first few presidents? I think it's okay because people don't know the history, but they think 13 colonies banded together, we beat England, and afterwards, we elected Washington and life was grand. And it could not be anything further from the truth than that. But being Yorktown was the last major battle, do you have, and maybe you don't know because you haven't reached that yet, but is that going to be the last or near the last episode, or have you put any thought on how far you want to take your podcast?
This episode is brought to you by Coffee Mate. After watching this season of the HBO's original series, The White Lotus, this is the tropical getaway I needed. One more pina colada, please.
Hey, you're not on mute.
Oh, I thought I was in paradise. Turns out it was my Coffee Mate. Coffee Mate pina colada and Thai iced coffee flavored creamers, inspired by the newest season of HBO's original series, The White Lotus. For the love of coffee. Try now.
We off? 30 seconds of carefree bliss. Oof, like wind in your hair carefree. Oh, like using Clorox disinfecting all-purpose cleaner in the home carefree. Yes! Like dog slobbing on the coffee table and cleaning it with Clorox carefree. He's on a roll now. Spit toothpaste on the faucet. You got it. You got it. Peanut butter on the light switch. Oh, spritz, spritz. Spritz, spritz. Clorox, man. Clean feels good. Okay, we're back. Use as directed.
I haven't decided exactly how far I will go, but certainly there's 18 months of war after Yorktown, which I absolutely want to cover before we get to the treaty. Poor John Lawrence gets killed in there, so it certainly wasn't over for him at Yorktown. We then have about 7 years of chaos in America, where we are struggling as independent states, not sure that we're going to form a single country. People just assume that, all right, well, once we won the war, it was inevitable that there would be a United States of America. Absolutely not the case. And you know, to bring up the slavery issue again, a lot of people said, well, why didn't they end slavery at the Constitution? There would not have been a United States if the northern states had attempted to end slavery at the Constitutional Convention. The southern states simply would not have joined. And the founders said, our priority is creating a United States, and we can deal with the problems that exist within that United States once we have a United States. So there's a lot to cover there through the Constitutional Convention and probably even beyond that a little bit. I'm not sure. Right now, it takes me about 30 or so episodes, 30, 35 episodes to get through 1 year of war. In some of these post-war years, I'm sure I will get through a year of actual time in a much shorter time, maybe 5 or 10 episodes. So I won't be covering it as intensively as I've covered the war. But I think there's still a lot of interesting things happening. The quasi-war, Shays Rebellion, Doer's Rebellion, things like that are still going on during this time that are very interesting, that most people don't know about and that are worth covering.
Okay. Well, I'm just glad that there's a lot more to come, because I'm not the only one. Obviously, millions of people love what you're doing and probably don't look forward to the day where you say, well, this is my last episode. Maybe you'll do a spinoff. I just love the fact that I can talk to somebody else that understands the process of researching and putting together a podcast and all of that. If there's a young kid or maybe even an adult out there that's listening, maybe they're interested in doing a podcast or writing a book or an article about the revolution. Is there any advice or something that you would want to tell them that might help them in that beginning early stages process?
Well, for me, it's always been about finding interesting stories. Don't worry about names and dates and all that stuff. That's nice, but what really captures people's imagination are the interesting stories, the stories of human and how they did what they did and why they did what they did is the most interesting thing to cover.
Stories. Yeah.
Yep.
Is there anything else at all that you would like to share with everybody involving or about the American Revolution?
Well, as I said, I find the era absolutely fascinating. I think people don't appreciate how different the world was before the revolution because we take for granted so many of the freedoms and concepts of how government should work. We take that for granted today because of what happened in the American Revolution. So the way the world changed as a result of this era is just, it's a really big deal, and people need to understand that.
Well, I could talk to you for the rest of the day and probably the rest of the week, but wanting to be as respectful as I can, I've taken up a lot of your time already, but we'll wrap it up here. And if you have not listened to his podcast, go to my show notes, click it. You will be very happy that you did. It's a phenomenal podcast. And I'd really highly encourage you to visit his blog. It has as much information in the podcast. There's just even more treasures to be found on your blog page, and I will have links to everything associated with Mr. Troy in my show notes. For you listeners, it's patriotpowerpodcast.com. And lastly, nobody likes to talk about this, but I hope that you consider donating to his podcast, or any podcast for that matter, that you find of value, because donations help with a couple things. The time, which you oftentimes can't put a dollar price tag on, and it helps offset the cost. And I think that he does this for the love and the passion that he has for the revolution. But as with anything else, there's costs involved. So a great way to support and show your support is to make a donation. So I think you have a PayPal button right on your blog, so people can just click it, make a donation. Doesn't have to be 5 million, but if you want to do 5 million, I don't think he'd turn it down. A couple bucks here, a couple bucks there. Be a show sponsor. Sponsor the show for $5 a month. It's $60 a year. I mean, that's probably what you spend in 3 days at buying coffees. So help offset some of his costs. I just want to thank you again. You are a treasure trove of information, and it is so nice to have you and your voice and your humor and all of the information in a structured, easy to read, full of research. I mean, it's phenomenal. So I really want to thank you for what you've done to me personally and inspiring me, but as well as all the people that you are helping shed the story of the founding of our country, and for people that many don't hear about. And again, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.